So I've been active in climate research, since 2002 or something
Mhm.
like that. And they were discussing ice ages, and it transpired that nobody knew how ice ages happen. And I couldn't believe that in the 21st century, we didn't know how they happened. We know the basics. We know it's something to do with orbital cycles, but nobody could explain why all of the ice ages happened in the way that they happen. And so I did some research and came up with a theory. And a professor over in Canada said, "No, that's pretty good. I like that.
Mhm.
Do you want to make that into a peer-reviewed climate paper?" And I said, "Yeah, so that's fine."
Yeah.
So he came on board and showed me the ropes on that and did all of the graphs, because the graphs are a little bit technical. And we made this climate paper, which has been very successful. It's had 45,000 downloads. It's a peer-reviewed paper, fairly controversial because it says that CO2 is not the primary feedback agent controlling temperature. So the paper is complex. It's like 36 pages or something, but the actual explanation, we can probably get through the explanation in
Yeah,
about
let's
15
go
minutes.
through the explanation more so than the actual fine detail of it, I think would
Yeah,
be good. Yeah.
we can do this in about 15 minutes because
Yeah.
the
Mm,
underlying rationale is not very
mm.
difficult. So it's called Modulation of Ice Ages by Dust and Albedo Feedbacks by myself and Professor Michael Palmer. And we come back to this graph that we've seen in the previous talk we were just talking about. So this is temperature versus CO2 in the ice ages. We've got 800,000 years of data here. Temperature in red, CO2 in blue, and they are in lockstep together. And some people have erroneously assumed from this that CO2 is controlling temperature, which is not correct, as we shall see, because correlation does not imply causation. We need a rationale. We need some sort of explanation for why we have this correlation.
Mm.
Alternatively, we could say that every time CO2 is high, the world cools. And every time CO2 is low, the world warms. So we could say that high CO2 causes cooling and low CO2 causes warming. Now, it's more complex than that, as we'll see, but you can see from this that other factors are involved
Mm.
in modulation of ice ages, because this would not happen if CO2 was a very strong greenhouse gas. So, what causes ice ages? Well, the primary effect is the Earth's orbital cycles. So um, we have I'm not going to explain these in any detail, but we have three or four primary orbital cycles. We have the precession of the Earth's axis, which is initially a 26,000 year cycle. So this is the wobble of the Earth as it
Mm.
wobbles on its axis like a gyroscope. But in climatic terms, it comes down to about 22,000 year cycle. So a big, long cycle. Then we have obliquity of the Earth's axis. That's just the angle of the Earth,
Mm.
whether it's leaning more or less. And that's a 40,000 year cycle. Then we have the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, how near or far it is from the sun. And it varies, it's like about 3% or something. So it does have an effect on the Earth's climate. And then we have apsidal precession, which we'll forget about. But if you get all four of those orbital cycles and combine them together, we get the Milankovitch cycle, which people are probably familiar with.
Mm.
And it's the Milankovitch cycle which controls climate on long-term climate, not the
Mm.
short-term climate we've got over the last 30 years, but in terms of the millennial um, climate. And another way of explaining that is a great year, which is about 23,000 years long. Now, I call it a great year because I think that's explanatory. So it's very similar to an annual year, but longer. So if you have a great summer in the north, you have a great winter in the south. And so it behaves very much like an annual year. And it swaps around, of course. Great winter in the north equals great summer in
Mm-hmm.
the south, but over 23,000 years long. And that obviously has an effect on climate. Like, the annual summer in the north will make it warmer in the north. And that's exactly what it does on a 23,000 year cycle. Um, so we've got some graphs, but these graphs are fairly easy to look at. There's nothing difficult about these. The first one is temperature versus orbital cycles. This comes from the Epica 3 ice core down in Antarctica. We've got temperature in red. The great years that we've just discussed are in blue. And here we've got 450,000 years of data. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 interglacials. Obviously, the red line at the top means hotter, and down at the bottom means colder. So all of the peaks are all interglacials, and we're currently in an interglacial, the Holocene interglacial. That's why it's warm. Normally, the Earth is much colder. We're in a warm period at present. But you can see from this that the great year peaks when we have a maximum in the great year gives an interglacial. Every interglacial is linked to a great year. The problem, and the problem that was never explained, and the problem that I wanted to explain because it's never been explained before, is why don't all of the great years create an interglacial? We should have an interglacial every 23,000 years, but we don't. You can see loads of these great years, great summers in the northern hemisphere, have no warming. Some of them, like, I don't know, 160, 70,000 years ago, a very high peak with no warming whatsoever. Same if you look at sort of 70,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago. Two very large peaks, but not very much warming. So this was the primary question, is why do some great years, some great summers in the northern hemisphere create warming and others do not? So why is the temperature response selective? There must be another factor involved that's not orbital cycles. It must be a feedback agent on Earth that's causing this. Now, if you look at climate science, they will say, oh, it's CO2 because everything has to be CO2. But CO2 would not cause this response. Remember, CO2 is proportional to temperature, so it goes up and down with temperature. So the blue,
I remember.
what did we have it? We had CO2 in blue last time. It would follow temperature exactly. CO2 could not cause this response, this selective response. So we've got to look for something else. So CO2 is not the feedback. The feedback is actually ice sheet albedo. Albedo being the reflectivity of the ice, as we were talking about before. Bright white ice can reflect 97, our old 97%.
Oh, yeah. Don't you start.
97% of the instant sunlight will be reflected back into space by bright white ice sheets. Whereas if you make them dirty, then only 20% goes back into space. So it makes a big difference. So ice sheets and albedo. What's the albedo? Well, I've got a little diagram here. Very simplistic, but anyway, it gives us the idea. The sun shines down onto a nice white ice sheet with high albedo, and the sun's rays are reflected out into space. How do we stop that? How do we increase temperatures on Earth? Well, we just cover the ice in dust or soot, and that will darken the ice sheets, and now all of the sunlight is being absorbed. And that has a huge, great warming effect on the Earth. Then we look at CO2. So how do you get dust? This was the main aspect of my paper, which is totally different to any paper that has ever been produced before. This is why it is totally novel. How do you create the dust? Well, we go back into this diagram we've seen before about CO2. So what's the difference in these plants? Well, CO2, of course, those on the left have lots of CO2, those on the right have very little. And obviously, if you have not enough CO2, the plants all die, as you can see. So during the Ice Age maximum, which is only like 17,000 years ago.
The Little Ice Age, yeah.
No, not the Little Ice Age. We're talking the last glacial maximum before our interglacial started. So at its depth was about 17,000 years ago. We were at the glacial maximum. Then it started to warm. Over the next 5,000 years, it warmed into the Holocene interglacial. Then we had a little bit of a younger Dryas cold period, which lots of people are still debating why that happened. And then we went back into the Holocene interglacial. So the maximum cold was 17,000 years ago. But at the same time, the least CO2 we had because of this oceanic absorption. We were talking about the solubility of the oceans for CO2. The colder the oceans get, the more CO2 goes into the oceans. So the oceans suck up all of the CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's what they did. And so during the last ice age, CO2 went down to 190 parts per million, which is very low. And up on the highlands of China, in highlands of Asia, I should say, the equivalent CO2 went down to 150 parts per million. And as you can see with the plants on the right-hand side here, that is the death zone for plants, and all of the plants died. So during the last ice age, all life on Earth nearly died out because we had not enough CO2. So we nearly extinguished all life on Earth. That's how important CO2 is for the biosphere. But that actually happened on the highlands of Asia. It went down to 150 parts per million. And at that altitude, so concentration at altitude went to 150 parts per million. And low CO2, as we've seen, equals plant death, and therefore equals CO2 desert. So we ended up with a huge, great shifting sand desert across most of Asia, to the east of the Himalayas. And that enormous great desert caused dust. And we know the dust was coming from that region because the dust in the Arctic, in Greenland, was isotopically analyzed to have come from the Gobi Desert region. That's where it came from. Which
right, okay. Because I thought that when you were talking about dust, it was only from like synthetic sort of man-made produced.
Oh, yeah, but not this amount of time ago. So in the modern environment, yes, we have a problem with Chinese industrial dust.
Yeah.
But 17,000 years ago, this was natural dust. How do you produce natural dust? Because the dust peak is enormous. It goes up, I forget how many fold. It goes up to 2,500 parts per million. It's going up something like, 500 fold. It goes up an enormous amount. How do you suddenly produce all of this extra dust? Well, it comes from these CO2 deserts, which have just been created by the cold weather, absorbing all the CO2, killing the plants, creating CO2 deserts. And all of that dust gets blown across the northern hemisphere. And we know that this dust was coming from this region by the lowest plateau in China, where a lot of this dust was deposited, and that we've got this enormous great region in China called the lowest plateau, which is all formed by dust. And it's very unstable, of course, because the rivers can cut through it very, very easily. But where you do where you do a cross section through the dust layers,
Mm.
you can see all of the ice ages in the dust layers in exactly the same fashion as you can see the ice layers in the ice cores that they've been doing in Greenland and down in the Antarctic. So you've got all of a record of all of the ice ages just in this dust.
So are you, so sorry,
Because
can I just clarify? So we're talking about dust that was created from like you say, the CO2 deserts, right?
hmm,
That then blew into the Arctic, and I thought it was only dark dust that had a problem because it absorbed.
yeah, no, all dust will have a problem. Obviously, the most potent is black carbon. So if you get
Yeah.
soot deposits from burning forests, for instance, that's really highly effective. But even normal dust will darken the ice
Right.
sheets by a considerable amount.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, even sand and dust from a
Right.
normal desert will actually darken the. They in my paper, I discuss quite a lot of these
Mm.
dust on snow projects. They've had quite a few people go
Mm.
up into northern Canada and so on, and they start spreading dust on the ice to see
Mm.
what effect it has and um, how much sunlight it can absorb.
Mm.
And it's actually quite effective in
Mm.
absorbing a lot of sunlight.
So do you think this is what leads to the Roman warming period and the medieval warming period?
No, not necessarily. We don't know why those warming periods happened. We've got the Roman warm period, we've got the Minoan
Mm.
warm period, we've got the medieval warm period, which all seem to be spaced,
Mm.
about 1,000 years apart. We still don't have any idea why they happened. I've not seen any good rationale for why those warming periods happened with 1,000-year spacing. So that is unexplained. So yeah, don't let anyone try and tell you
Yeah,
that
well,
the science is settled. It's not
no, but well,
settled.
one thing we do know is it's not man-made because there was nothing,
Yeah,
there's no
yeah, it
industrial
wasn't man-made, and the
emissions.
Little Ice Age wasn't man-made. Now,
Yeah,
some people
yeah.
say the Little Ice Age might be due to a solar grand minima.
Mm.
Again, we don't know that because we don't have enough data. We've
Mm.
only had one grand minima, and now we're possibly in a second grand minima. So when you've only got two data points, you can't really say
Mm.
if cooling is, due to a grand minima. Likewise, with the warming, we've only got three data points, and I've not seen any rationale for what caused those warming events.
It has to be to do with the sun, though, right? It has to be.
I mean, that's a good option. Yeah.
Mm.
It could be solar effects, but, looking at, people have done um, modeling using proxies, looking at solar cycles into the past
Mm.
and not seeing too much of a difference in solar output. Now they're only using proxies, so it's not
Mm.
good data. They're using things like stalactites and things like that, looking at the growth of stalactites and the chemical composition of the minerals in those stalactites, which gives you an idea about solar cycles because of the amount of cosmic radiation and so on.
Mm.
But nevertheless, they've not proven that I've seen that there was any great difference in solar output.
Mm.
Maybe that will change. Maybe because someone can point me towards a paper that has shown that, but I've not
Mm.
seen it.
Okay.
But yes, on those short scales, that's not the same as ice ages. Ice ages are operating over 23,000 year scales,
Mm.
um, which is the Great Summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And the Ice Age itself is working over 80,000 year cycles and 120,000 year cycles, so much longer cycles. And we still don't know exactly. We don't know why the shorter ones are happening, but now we do know why the longer ones are happening because my explanation explains everything. So at last we know why ice ages happen, and it's because dust gets on the northern ice sheets. Because remember, these are only northern hemisphere events.
Right.
That's another reason for disregarding CO2. Interglacials only happen in northern hemisphere great summers.
What
They
do you mean
don't
by
happen in
interglacial? Sorry, when you say that in that context.
that's well, we're in a glacial cycle.
Yeah.
So we've been cold for the last million years. You could extend that out to 5 million years. So it's normally cold, and
Mm.
then suddenly you get an enormous warming event
Mm.
for a very short period of time, only 5,000 years.
Yeah.
That is an interglacial, a very sudden warming event, which normally only lasts a very short amount of time. And we are in a warming event now. We're in an
Oh, I see.
interglacial.
Oh, so
But
interglacial means between two cold points of
yeah,
time.
between
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
cold
Yeah. Okay.
eras.
Yeah. I know.
It's a warm era in
Yeah.
between two cold bits. Ours is a bit different because it's an obliquity led interglacial. So ours is longer. Ours is going to last about 15,000 years,
Mm.
as opposed to the normal interglacial, which only lasts for about 5,000 years.
Mm.
But we won't go into why that happens. What we don't know is why they are intermittent, why some of the great summers don't operate, and why it only happens in the northern hemisphere. It doesn't happen for southern hemisphere great summers, because if CO2 was the controlling agent, it would happen in northern hemisphere and southern
Mm.
hemisphere
Yeah.
great summers.
Yeah.
So yeah, the idea here is that it's being caused by dust. So it's dusty ice sheets that
Mm.
create the warming.
Amazing.
So let's look at those graphs. This is CO2 versus dust. And so we've got CO2 on the top, dust on the bottom. And we've got 800,000 years of data here, again from the Epocha 3 ice core down in Antarctica. And this is a correlation between CO2 and dust, because everyone says there's a correlation between CO2 and temperature.
Mm.
Yeah, but they're missing out the dust as the intermediary between these two. So we can see in this, and I'll put up some arrows, every time CO2 is low, dust is high. And that is causal. That's not correlation, not simply correlation. That is actually causal. So the dust is being caused by low CO2. As we said before, it's low CO2 is causing CO2 deserts and therefore creating lots of dust.
Yeah.
And that, if we look at the next graph,
By the way,
which is
what's KY, by the way? I'm trying to work that out.
oh, thousands of years.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Kilo years.
Kilo
yeah,
years. Yeah. Okay.
Thousands
Yeah.
of years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this again is 800,000 years of data. On the top is temperature in red, and the bottom one is dust in green again.
Mm.
And this time we're looking at the effects of dust on temperature. And again, this is causal. This is not simply a correlation. So looking from below to above now, every time dust is high, we get warming. So every interglacial is preceded by 10,000 years of dust. And nobody has really brought this out at all whatsoever before, that in order to get an interglacial, you need dirty ice sheets. You need dust on ice. Otherwise, you cannot generate enough warming to create an interglacial. And that is why a lot of great summers never produce an interglacial, because if you have a great summer putting all of its energy onto bright white ice, all of that energy is reflected back out into space again. And it has no effect on temperature of the Earth. Whereas if you get dusty ice with 10,000 years of dust all over it, because remember, the ice will melt, but the dust will remain there on the surface all the time. It'll just go down and down and down as the ice melts.
I was going to say that the dust is always going to remain then. So how is
remain there on the
how is
surface.
it still cyclical then? How can it peak and trough then?
Until the whole of the ice sheet disappears. So you've got this massive great ice sheet which expands all the way down to 52 degrees north, covering all of Canada, all the way down to sort of New York, all of Europe down to halfway down Britain, down to about Birmingham. That's how far the ice extended. Now, it will continue to melt as long as you've got a great summer. So this only occurs with a great summer warming. and the whole of the ice sheet covered in dust. That dust will stay there, as you said, and it'll stay there until the ice sheet just melts all the way back to Scandinavia and beyond, until the whole of the ice sheet is gone.
Okay, I'm not. I know it's a silly question, but does it actually melt? Because is that not another myth?
Oh no, it certainly melts. We've got huge amounts of data on that. If you look at the Badlands over in Washington State, where they've got the scouring of the land by the amount of water that came off the Laurentide ice sheets. What do they call those lands? If you look at the videos by the geologist, and I can't remember his name at present, the old geologist with the bushy beard, I forget what his name is at present. He does lots of tours around these badlands in Washington State in Northwest America, where they tour all of the vast river basins that have been caused by enormous great rivers that have come off the ice sheet. So these not normal rivers. The water often gets dammed by ice dams, and then the ice dam will break, and all of this water will just charge across the region, just scouring all of the land, leaving sand ripples, sand ripples from a normal beach. But these are sand ripples that are like 2 kilometers wide, sort of, well, maybe not that much, but, a kilometer wide, instead of being a tiny ripple under your feet. But these ripples were caused by the enormous flows of water coming off the Laurentide ice sheet.
Because the sea levels aren't actually rising, though, are they?
Oh, yes, they rose 140 meters.
Really?
So sea levels during the Ice Age were 140 meters lower than now. A lot lower. So, things like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia did not exist. They're saying the Great Barrier Reef, is affected by climate. Well, it wasn't even there 17,000 years ago, because the sea levels were 140 meters lower. So there was no English Channel, for instance. You could walk across from France to Britain. There was no North Sea. The North Sea was all dry land. It was called Doggerland. And we know it was dry land because we've got mammoths all the way across it. So one of the things they were doing many years ago, I think they've run out of them now, but the fishermen in the North Sea were always dragging up tusks from mammoths in the North Sea, because all of that was dry land.
But this sort of stuff this is like hundreds of thousands of years, right?
No, 17,000 years. So it's only 17,000 years ago.
Because if sea levels are rising, why are all the politicians, world leaders, buying seaside property?
Well, it's not now. Yeah, well, we've run out of the Ice Age ran out of puff like about 5,000 years ago. So the sea levels were rising up until, say, 8,000 years ago, something like that. They reached a maximum during the Holocene maximum, and they slightly reduced after the Holocene maximum. Now they're sort of slightly increasing again because we're slightly warming again. So during the Roman period, sea levels were about a meter higher than now. And now we actually went down after the Roman, because the Roman period was a warm period. The medieval warming period was a warm period. Sea levels would have been slightly higher. And then we came down to a minimum in the Little Ice Age, which is about, the sort of 17th, 18th century. We came down to cold conditions, a lower sea level. Not by a huge amount, but by a small amount.
Yeah, people were ice skating on the Thames, weren't they? I think
it was quite cold then. Yeah. So, say sea levels were, I'm just guessing here because I don't know, 30 centimeters lower during the Little Ice Age. Well, obviously, since the Little Ice Age, sea levels have been going up a little bit. Now, that's only since the Little Ice Age. If you do your calculation from the Roman period, 2,000 years ago, sea levels at present are actually lower than they were during the Roman period. So sea levels do go up and down a little bit, but not by the huge amounts that, Greta the Gremlin is trying to tell us. It's not going to be, if the world warms by say 2 degrees, like it was during the Holocene maximum. Sea levels at that time, I think someone said they were about 2 meters higher than now. But that was 2 degrees warmer. That was quite a lot warmer during the Holocene maximum. That's like 8,000 years ago. Roman period, I think sea levels were about a meter higher than now. If you look at all the Roman ports in the Mediterranean, now you've got to look at the land differences as well, because there has been some land movements there as well. But generally, most Roman ports are a meter higher than they should be. So the sea level has reduced by about a meter from the time that those ports were actually made. If you look at Ephesus, on the Greek mainland, or Didymus, sorry, it used to be Greek, it's now Turkish, Didymus, again on the Turkish coast, the ports that they made are about a meter higher than they should be. I mean, there's no water in them.
So sea levels are going down, is what you're saying?
Yeah, since the Roman period, yes. Yeah. The sea levels are up and down all over the place.
So when they say sea levels are rising, it's the opposite.
That's only since the Little Ice Age. They keep measuring since the Little Ice Age, right, which is the wrong time to be doing it. That's cherry picking, because the Little Ice Age was cold, and therefore sea levels were slightly higher. Sea levels were slightly lower during the Little Ice Age. So if you measure from the Little Ice Age, of course, it looks like we've got rising sea levels.
But yeah, you have to go back a wider snapshot of time.
Yeah, if you go back to the medieval period or the Roman warm period, we've got slightly lower levels than the Roman warm period.
And the temperatures is going down since the Roman warming period, right?
Oh yes, it's colder now than it was in the Roman warm period. Yeah,
and the medieval.
They were growing grapes in Britain, and certainly much colder than it was during the Holocene maximum 8,000 years ago, because we know the northern forest tree line was up to 200 kilometers further north.
So basically, temperatures are going down across a wide.
Over the Holocene, they've been decreasing. Ever since 8,000 years ago, with various bumps in between. So there was a bump for the Minoans, the Romans, and then the medieval. There was
but then they take a very tiny snapshot of the last few hundred years, and they say it's hockey. They focus on the hockey stick.
Absolutely, it's all cherry picked, and also it's not very easy to measure sea levels. For instance, sea levels in Scandinavia are going down quite rapidly, very rapidly, in fact. So some ports that were built, 500 years ago, are now above sea level because of isostatic, what do they call it? Isostatic rebound from the Ice Age. So during the Ice Age, Scandinavia and Scotland were covered in ice, and that pushed the land down. It physically pushed the land down. Now the ice is gone, the land is coming back up again. And so if you look in Scotland and Scandinavia and Canada, you will see raised beaches. You will see a beach, a normal sandy beach, 30 meters above sea level. So even though sea levels have risen after the Ice Age because of the melting of the ice, that land has actually risen even more, and you'll find that the beach is like now 30 meters above the current sea level. And then you will find another beach below it at like 20 meters, and then another beach below that at 10 meters above sea level, and then another beach at sea level. So you get these raised beaches, as they call them, because the land has been rising, because all of the weight has been taken off it. Conversely, if you look at London, that sort of region, the land is actually falling because the land is tipping completely. So it's rising up in Scotland, and therefore London and Kent in the south is actually going down.
Oh, okay.
So just measuring the sea level at various ports won't give you a very precise measure of world sea level,
Hmm.
because all of the land is heaving and shifting. The land is going up and down all over the place. Every piece of land everywhere in the world is moving, going up or down. So yeah, lots of the land in the Mediterranean is slightly going up a little bit because Africa is squishing the Mediterranean and making some of the land there rise. And then you've got another problem in that the world is not spherical gravitationally. So the world is a gravitational geoid. It is not a perfect circle. So the sea around Britain is 150 meters higher than the sea around the Caribbean. Now, that doesn't mean you can ski downhill towards the Caribbean because it's a gravitational plane. What's happening is the land around Europe is a gravitational hotspot, and therefore the water gathers around that hotspot. And so the seas are actually higher around Europe than they are around America. Now, okay, that doesn't affect us because we go on a gravitational plane, so we don't notice it. You know, a ship cannot go downhill, as it were, towards the Caribbean. But if you've got a satellite in space that's trying to measure sea levels, it will measure 140 meter, 150 meter difference between the Caribbean and Britain. And you've got to allow for that in your calculations of total world sea level. So if someone is quoting you a rise of 1 millimeter in sea level per year or something, yeah, okay, but you're having to allow for tides, winds, and the gravitational geoid before you can start. And some of those are measured in meters, not in millimeters, and yet they're quoting a sea level rise to the nearest millimeter. I'm not sure I entirely believe that. If you look at the cliff undercuts in the Mediterranean, so the Mediterranean is relatively stable. If you look at the land rising and falling. And the sea has been undercutting, as it does, the cliff faces, especially around eastern Spain and southern Turkey, are the ones I'm familiar with. And so you will see a big cliff and an undercut where the sea, because remember, there's no tides in the Mediterranean, so you get the sea constantly at one level. And it's undercut on a particular level, on that single level. And it's still on that level now because you can see the waves going in and out of the undercut.
Right.
So the question then is, how old is the cliff? Well, I climbed down the cliffs to have a look, and there were stalactites on the cliff face, which were 500 years old. So those cliff undercuts are of the realms of 500 years old, which is indicating that in the Mediterranean, all the way from Turkey all the way over to Spain, that the sea level in the Mediterranean has not changed in the last 500 years. So is the sea level drastically rising, that it's going to flood everywhere?
Yeah, no.
Not entirely sure myself. And as you say, all the politicians are buying houses on the seafront, you know.
Yeah, so clearly they don't think so.
They don't think so.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a long explanation of that, but I think it's valuable that people understand because these are all the effects they're trying to scare us with.
But it's this last one. It's the I've never heard this before, so this is
this is brand new.
Yeah,
this is groundbreaking. Yeah, and nobody has refuted my paper. So this paper's been out for 5 years.
Yeah.
Nobody has refuted this, and it's a perfect explanation because none of the other explanations have explained the full ice age cycle.
Can I ask then, when you talk about, you said this is no longer correlation, it's causal. Like, what does something have to be significant statistically for it to be considered causal and not correlative?
Well, it has to be a correlation for a start, of course. So you end up with a correlation, but then you have to have an explanation that underpins it, a
Yeah.
theory that underpins
Yeah.
that correlation. And the theory of CO2 never underpinned the correlation you see between CO2 and temperature.
Hmm.
For instance, as you were saying earlier, when you get warming before you get the CO2 increase.
Yeah.
That's been well known. It's about between 500 years and 700 years before the CO2 starts rising.
Mm.
So how can CO2 be causing temperature increase when it is rising after the temperature increase has already happened? Again,
Mm.
that is not a comprehensive theory. That does not explain anything because it's working the wrong way round. So you have a causal correlation. Sorry, you have a correlation, but it cannot be causal because temperature is rising before CO2 does. CO2 cannot be the causal agent because it only happens in the northern hemisphere. It only happens with northern hemisphere great summers. It doesn't happen with southern hemisphere great summers. CO2 is a global gas. It should operate in both hemispheres,
Mm.
and it doesn't. So this is limited to the northern hemisphere. Why? Because the dust only exists in the northern hemisphere, because there are no great land masses in the southern hemisphere. All of the large land masses are in the northern
Oh,
hemisphere.
right. Okay.
And the dust is coming from the northern hemisphere and it's going on to the northern hemisphere ice sheets. That's why it's northern hemisphere only. So CO2 just does not explain the correlation, whereas dust explains the correlation. It has many aspects which fully explain the cycle with no stones left unturned. So it explains why we get this intermittency on the great summers. We have many great summers that don't produce any warming. CO2 cannot explain that. And I keep asking, because obviously I debate this with climate scientists.
Yeah.
And I say, well, why do some great summers not produce an interglacial if CO2 is the feedback agent? And I get no reply.
Mm.
My theory says exactly why. It's because the ice sheets are too bright, too white, too high in albedo, and they're reflecting all of the increased temperature back into space. The sunlight doesn't even get a chance to warm up the Earth.
Yeah.
But if you get dirty ice sheets, of course, now it gets a chance to warm up the Earth.
Mm.
And every interglacial is preceded by dust, 10,000 years of dust. So
Mm.
we have a correlation, dust and temperature, and now we have a rationale for it. We have a reason, we have a theory.
So now it can be causal, yeah.
And so now it can become causal. Interglacial warming is not due to CO2 directly, it's only indirectly via dust and in an opposite sense. Yeah. So again, this is another reason why we can explain the correlation using dust, not CO2. In that first graph we looked at, it was always low CO2 causes warming. That would not happen if CO2 was the causal agent.
Mm.
The reason that happens is because low CO2 causes dust. Dust gets on the ice sheets, and it's the dusty ice sheets that causes the warming. That's why low CO2 causes warming. That's why it is in an opposite sense. Again, the CO2 does not explain, whereas the dust theory does explain. That's why we can consider it to be causal. So in summary, then, what have we learned? Ice age cooling is caused by orbital cycles. So we go into an ice age because of these orbital cycles. We go into a great winter in the northern hemisphere, and that winter will create bigger ice sheets. And those bigger ice sheets are a cooling factor, because the bigger the ice sheet, the more sunlight is reflected back into space. And so it's a big cooling agent, which will continue cooling the Earth until essentially you could end up with a snowball Earth. the ice feedback is so great, you could end up with the whole Earth just covered in ice if you don't have anything to oppose it. You have to have something to oppose it. Otherwise, you end up with a snowball Earth. So ice ages are maintained by the ice sheet albedo, the ice being white and reflective.
Mm.
Ice ages are ended by dust lowering the albedo, so making the ice sheets dark, which allows sunlight absorption and warming. And it's a very big warming agent.
Mm.
You know, they're talking about 4 watts per square meter for CO2 warming, with a little bit of water vapor warming.
And just say, what's the dust consist of again?
Just dust from a desert, you know, so it's just sandy dust and whatever dust you can get, even soil type organic dust from a region which originally had plant life on it, of course. So you've got maybe a soil depth of, you know, a meter or 2 meters, of soil. Suddenly you lose all the plants. Now all of that soil can be blown away.
Mm.
And what is soil? Soil is sand plus organic material. And all of that can be blown anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere.
So a desert begets more warming?
No, the desert doesn't. It's only the dust getting onto the ice sheet. So it's the dust from the desert.
Yes, what I mean. From the desert, it
moving onto the ice
warming,
sheet.
And then wouldn't that not create more desert-like environments? No.
No, because the desert was only caused by the CO2. It wasn't caused by the temperature. So there is no correlation in China between deserts and temperature. This was a conundrum. I go into this in my paper in some detail, that a lot of the paleoclimate weather maps are completely wrong.
Right.
When they did the research into China at where these deserts form, they found there was plenty of moisture and plenty of warmth in the Gobi region. So it wasn't the warmth or the lack of water that was causing the deserts. It was the lack of CO2 that caused the deserts. So the reason why the Gobi turned green again, because the Gobi Desert is not a desert. It's a prairie land.
Yeah.
It's a grassland. The reason it turned green again is because when the world went into an interglacial and warmed, more CO2 was released from the oceans. CO2 levels rose, and now you don't have a CO2 desert anymore, because now you've got sufficient CO2 for the plants to grow again. So the Gobi Desert regrew into a greenland because of the increase in CO2, not due to temperature.
Can I summarize then? So a desert will lose CO2. It creates dust. That dust will then go to the Arctic. That then covers the glaciers, and then it absorbs more heat. Then there's like a residual effect where it takes a number of years for that to, like a latent effect, right? And then that will be sucked into the Earth's, you know, biosphere, whatever you would call it, and then it would then produce more carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide would then go back into the desert lands, and then that will grow into vegetation, and so on.
Yes, but the storage medium is the oceans. So the storage reservoir of CO2 is the oceans.
Yes.
So when the oceans are cold, they'll absorb all the CO2. When you get an interglacial and the world warms, the oceans will release all of that CO2 back into the atmosphere. And now the plants can grow again because there's lots of CO2.
What's that latent? How long is that time from when it warmed? Thousands of years or hundreds of years, or
no, thousands. So the warming period is about 5,000 years. So we went from the glacial maximum, the absolute coldest, to the absolute warmest in about 5,000 years.
Right.
Which is actually quite rapid. I mean, that's
quite
rapid
quick,
warming.
Actually, yeah.
Again, CO2 could not explain that amount of rapid warming at 4 watts per square meter of feedback. The thing is that locally, measured on the ice sheets, the albedo feedback will give 200 watts per square meter,
Mm.
whereas CO2 will only give 4 watts per square meter after a whole 5,000 years, whereas the albedo feedback is 200 watts per square meter every year from year 1 all the way up to year 5,000. So it's a much, much stronger, much more powerful feedback agent than CO2. CO2 would never melt those ice sheets in 5,000 years. But the dust albedo feedback is very powerful, and it will melt the ice sheets. It's like if you get dirty ice at the roadside after a winter.
Mm.
So you get bright white ice, and then you get dirty ice where the cars have put mud and so on onto the ice sheets. And those areas will always melt much more quickly.
So we've still got like dust that's not from China right now on the glaciers. There must be, because it's cyclical. So
oh yes, it's still there in China. China. In Greenland, you can still see the original dust.
Yeah.
From 17,000 years ago is still there in the ice sheets.
Right. Okay.
But of course, that's way up in northern Greenland, and that's really not having any effect because the sunlight is quite minimal up there in northern Greenland. Because Greenland is still very high. It's 3,000 meters of ice. It's a huge amount of ice. But yes, the vast majority of all of those ice sheets managed to melt because of this dust on it.
Yeah, okay.
Greenland is different because it's a bowl. The topography of Greenland is very strange. I think because of the weight of the ice on it, it's formed a dish. So Greenland is a dish with mountains all around the outside on the coast and a great hollow in the middle. So because it's got a big hollow in the middle, the ice cannot slip off it. The water under the ice, because the ice melts due to the pressure underneath the ice, cannot escape because it's in this big hollow and it has great difficulty escaping. So Greenland cannot melt, or at least it cannot melt easily. Whereas the Laurentide ice sheets and the Great Asian ice sheet, they all melted. And the Scottish ice sheets and everything else, they all melted. But Greenland is a bit different, so it kept its ice.
Fair enough.
So dust is caused by CO2 deserts. They are not precipitation deserts, not caused by water. It's caused by a lack of CO2. CO2 deserts are caused by low CO2. Obviously, it's a lack of CO2 that kills all the plants. Thus, low CO2 causes interglacial warming. And that explains the entire ice age cycle, which is the opposite of classical climate claims. That is why low CO2 causes warming, which nobody in the CO2 market can actually, they can't explain it. How does low CO2 cause warming? Well, now we know. And if true for paleoclimate, maybe it's true for the present climate. But now, instead of dust from the Gobi Desert, we're talking about Chinese industrial dust getting onto the Arctic. And if CO2 is not causing present warming, then there's no need for any of this net zero expenditure. We might just be wasting all of our money because we're backing the wrong horse. And there's several horses, we've already talked about this, that might be causal for recent warming. It might be Chinese industrial dust on the Arctic ice sheets. It might be oceanic cycles, which have been in their warm period for the last 30-40 years and are now going into their cold periods. It might be solar influences and cosmic rays. There are any other number of possibilities that might be causing the present warming. And if they're only concentrating on CO2, if they are wrong, then we're just wasting our money, chasing the wrong goal because it's not CO2. And they've not proved that it's CO2. The work by Dr. John Christie measuring tropical tropospheric temperatures has indicated that they are wrong. The amount of greenhouse warming is not as great as surface warming. So the greenhouse warming measured in the troposphere, because that's where the greenhouse warming takes place, is only 1.1 degrees for a doubling of CO2, which is not a problem. Remember, the IPCC are estimating something like 4.5 degrees of warming, or a maximum of 7 degrees of warming for a doubling of CO2. Now, that's a problem. But Dr. John Christie's work using satellites to measure tropospheric warming has said that it's only a quarter of what the IPCC are saying. Again, if he is correct, then we're just wasting our money if we're looking for net zero. Because it might be just easier to mitigate against sea levels. I mean, the Dutch do that already. If sea levels are only going to be going up by a little bit because the warming is going to be a maximum of 1 degree sort of thing, we're going to get a very minimal amount of sea level rise. Well, you just mitigate that. You build more barriers. So we're wasting our money with all of these CO2 reductions when it might not be CO2 whatsoever. They have not proved that it is CO2 causing the warming and not one of these other mechanisms. So yeah, net zero finance is being wasted if they have got the wrong mechanism for global warming. And that's a problem because we've got to pay for it. And that's the end. Yeah.